Hello, and welcome to the Fast Forward Amy Show, the show where we talk about how you can live your life and business with simple strategies. I'm Fast Forward Amy, your host and coach, and I'll bring you a new episode every Tuesday. Welcome to this episode about finances, and before we get down and dirty, not sure I'm supposed to say that. This is episode 57, which means all of the tips and books I'm going to link up in this episode, you can find those through fastforwardamy.com/57 or click the link in the description. And I'm adding a money mindset guide to this. Although this episode isn't really about mindset, I do think it can be a great extra for you to cultivate a millionaire's money mindset. Go to fastforwardamy.com/money mindset guide. Today, I'll be talking a little bit ranty style about books that have influenced me in terms of finance. And whereas in other episodes, I've talked a lot about money mindset and abundance and practical business stuff, today is really about financial tips for anyone and about how you can make sure you have money instead of not having any money. A few years ago, I was very low on money, and I don't know if you know that story already, but there was a period in my time where I was actually very, very broke, and where I really was like, I can't go to the doctors because then maybe I need to go to the pharmacy, but I don't have money for that, even though a part of that gets paid back to you from the government here in Belgium. Still, it was all too tight for me, and as a result, already as a kid, I had been pretty obsessed with money and finances and numbers. But because of that situation, I got even more obsessed with it. And I decided to use that to my advantage. So I started reading up about it a lot. And I'd found some books from my dad. I'd found some books online. And I started positively obsessing about how you can handle money even when you don't really have any money yet. And one of the first books I read was The Richest Man in Babylon. The Richest Man in Babylon is a really tiny book. Can't show it to you because it's stuck somewhere in a box and it's also totally crumpled up, or how do you say that? The Richest Man in Babylon is a story, and I'm saying this, it's been years since I've read the book, but it talks about how when you have 100% of your income, even when it's not a lot, if you can run your life and maintain everything with 100%, you can also do it with 90%. And the big gist of the book is, if you would take away 10%, you would still be doing everything. You would still be okay, even if you don't have a lot. And back then I was still studying, and I'm a little bit of an Excel freak, or Google Sheets. I love using those. I should really follow a course though, because I waste a lot of time in Google Sheets. But I remember making this Excel sheet and looking at it like, okay, so if I'm making, let's say, 300 euros a month, that means I need to set aside 30 euros every month. And I thought, how am I going to do this? Because I want that to accumulate by itself. And I knew that it was going to be a danger if I would just depend on myself to make the transfer every month. So I set up an automatic transfer that there would be 30 euros every month going into a separate savings account, which was not linked to the account I could see on my phone. And I did that, and every month 30 euros went in there. And as I started progressing and making more money in my future, I increased that number and I added more transfers to it. And that's how I went from being broke and not having any money set aside and no savings whatsoever to kind of starting to accumulate a couple of €1,000. And that was a really nice buffer to have when later on I was faced with some new challenges. So the big theme of The Richest Man in Babylon, which is written by George S. Clason, if I remember correctly, is that you pay yourself first. And there are a lot of books about this. I think there's also the Profit First book and the Profit First method, which is a really famous book and method. I actually personally haven't read it. I will at some point. But the paying yourself first principle is really good because instead of looking at how much you can still save at the end of the month, you start your month with just already putting money aside, and then you'll deal with the rest of the month. So what that means is you can't accidentally not end up saving, and you'll make do. It's kind of the same as saying, instead of paying everything by card, you know that when you get everything in cash, you can just only spend that cash on stuff you want. I did that even before I read the book. Back when I lived in Italy, I was also on a tight student budget, and I was spending more. Well, I was just spending a lot of money. I lived in the center of Florence, and things go fast then. So I had decided, like, oh, I really need to temper this. So instead of always paying by card, I got my budget for example, for groceries and social stuff in cash, and I knew like this is my budget every day, and I just had like an envelope for every 2 weeks. This might sound a little bit obsessive, I don't know, but it's definitely paid off for me in the long run, because having a grip on your finances is really good. And although I talk a lot about abundance, it doesn't mean that making a budget or doing stuff like this is a form of scarcity. In fact, paying yourself first is a mindset of abundance where you truly believe like everything will be okay, and there is more than enough to also set aside money for myself. So, The Richest Man in Babylon, I'm sure if you get the book, you will read it in one night. I think my oldest brother, Timothy, was like, the book is so simple, it makes so much sense, like, don't even bother. But I really liked it because it just highlights some of these elements with simple stories. And for me, it's been something I've been doing ever since. And the fun part is those transfers are still running. And what I've also done later in my business is, especially in Belgium, I don't know how it is in other countries, but there is this thing when you start your own business and you become an entrepreneur, and you always only have your money in your business and you never have any money privately, because accountants tell you fiscally it's more optimal to not pay yourself too much, keep it in the business. Everyone is like, reinvest, put the funds towards new assets. Accountants here say like you need to make more costs or you're gonna pay too much in taxes. I think most of that is total crap, and I believe that it is very bad for your mindset if you will always end up feeling poor privately. So early on in my entrepreneurial career, I decided I don't want to always be private poor. So even when it was fiscally less optimal, I still chose to pay myself a little bit of a higher wage from the moment it was possible, of course. Like in the beginning, it's not always possible. But I decided to do that because I was like, at least then I will have an abundant mindset by myself as well. And I can cut myself away from looking at myself and the business as one. And I think I really profited from that in the long term. In that same time period, though, and this is actually a different tip, not related to book, but I read more and more about finances, and I came across this dude. I don't remember his name, but he was an American financial coach. By the way, a lot of American financial books are interesting, but we can't really do a lot with them in Europe because it's like the 401ks and a bunch of principles we can't really use. For example, I read I Will Teach You to Be Rich from by Ramit Sethi. It's a good book, but some things you just can't do in Europe. So I'll leave that up to you, but I like the book. Anyways, going back to what I was saying is I got this tip and it talked about resetting your finances and your financial mindset by making sure you always have a buffer. That made a lot of sense to me because I was already saving money automatically, although it was not a lot. It was like 30, 50 euros and then 100 euros and kept increasing every month. And it said like you need to have at least like 1,000 euros cash, like put away somewhere in your house. I didn't have that then, so I set it as a goal like I'm going to earn 1,000 euros cash and then I'm going to like put it in an envelope and like hide it in my house or in my apartment. And I did that. And those are a few small things, but coming from someone who had been totally broke, those things really reset my mindset in not always feeling like I didn't have any money. Because I was like, if something happens, if shit hits the fan, and I came from a scarcity and a fear mindset, I knew I was going to be okay. In business, they say you need to have your overhead set aside for at least 3 months. But privately, it's also nice to know that you just literally have 1,000 euros cash laying around. It's also very typical, by the way, for people who have been broke to always carry around a lot of cash, although we don't really live in a cash day and age anymore. But that's definitely a tip I would say. So far we have our first tip is to pay yourself first. And I would recommend you put 10% of your income aside every month automatically with like an automatic transfer to another savings account that you don't see in your normal login of your banking app. The second tip is just put 1,000 euros aside as a buffer in your home and hide it somewhere. This is no finance bloggers can listen to this episode probably. Um, and then next up, I want to talk about Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And I read that in the same time frame. So I tend to obsess about things and then I let go once I've like installed it. And finance has definitely been one of those things. Although I gotta add, later on, I will make a follow-up episode of this, of everything I've learned about finances in my business right now. Because as I was buying a house, getting a loan, I learned way more than I wanted to learn. I'll tell you that. But back to Robert Kiyosaki. Rich Dad, Poor Dad, great book. Really famous book. I think if you look up the top 10 business books in the world or top 10 finance books, it will definitely pop up in a lot of places. And the gist of the book is that in finances and in positions, you have assets and you have liabilities. Now, in business, you have those too in your statements, but let's look at them as he means them. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's his book, not mine. But assets are things that will actually put money in your pocket, and liabilities are things that take money out of your pocket. An asset being something that actually gives you a return on investment. So, for example, anything you invest in that will earn you more in the long run, right? A liability is something that will actually only decrease in value or cost you more money. Some people are gonna not like that I'm gonna say this, but a boat is a great example of a liability. A boat costs you a lot of money every year to maintain. It's a really nice dream to have a boat, but in reality, it's probably better to hire a really expensive boat at some point with like a captain and everything and spend a fortune a week, but not have all of the costs that will just like bleed you out over time because a boat will decrease and decrease and decrease in value. Most cars will also decrease in value. The moment you buy a new car and you drive it out of a garage, it will cost you more money, actually, and it will decrease in value. An opposite of that could be old-timer cars, for example. An old-timer car will often increase in value, so then it would be an asset. I'm gonna be honest, before I recorded this episode, I looked it up again to be sure I wasn't gonna bullshit about this. And sometimes you can also have liabilities that will turn into assets. Maybe a really, really, really old boat will become an asset. I don't entirely know. But life or your possessions are divided into assets and liabilities. So this is one of the reasons why I wouldn't necessarily want to buy a new car. If I can also buy a second-hand car and it has a couple of miles on it, but it's still really good, but it just costs a lot less. Because for me, it's a liability anyways. Assets could be, for me, buying stock in a company and seeing that company grow. It's also like, I guess it's also my own company. Anything that where you see an increase in value over time, or when it more than pays for itself. So that could also be buying a studio, renting it out as an Airbnb, and it pays more to you than you are paying for it. Of course, there is a fine line. Things can change over time if we look at global crises. How do you say that? For example, it could be that all of a sudden you can't rent out your studio anymore and you have a problem. But passive revenue is a great example of investing in making one thing one time and then it will pay you back over and over and over again. There's a great return on investment there. So that's a really great asset to have, like an online passive income funnel. So my first tip was pay yourself first, like 10% automatically. If you can amp it up, I'm sure you can do 20% as well. I'm not saying you have to save everything. Please splurge on yourself. I'm all for the spending lifestyle. I love spending money. I think that's also a skill you need to create abundance for yourself. But still, setting 10% aside, it's nice to have money, you know? Saving is also nice to see that accumulating. Second tip was set a buffer aside. I would tell you to just go and earn 1,000 euros and set it aside. The third tip was, assets versus liabilities. Make sure you spend your resources on assets instead of on liabilities, and at least be aware of what you're doing. And I would definitely recommend to go and read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or listen to it on Audible, for example. And last but not least, I want to highlight a thing that came up for me as I was prepping for this episode, namely the poor man's problem. The poor man's problem is where because you're always broke, you're always paying more money for stuff too. It's like when you know you can cut a huge deal on something if you pay it at once versus if you pay it in pieces and you're paying way more for it, which is typically something they will do in the United States, because they'll be like, oh, you can get this on credit, but then you'll pay a lot more and interest fees and everything because you can't pay it at once. The poor man's problem is where you always have to choose for the worse option, worser. I don't know. Where you have to choose the less than optimal option because you can't afford to choose the other option. My advice there would be to really look at what you're doing and how you can step out of the cycle of the poor man's problem. I can't really give you a concrete example of what that is right now, but if you sometimes feel like you keep getting stuck in a short-term cycle with your money, look at what the long-term could be. And if you can break through that by getting a loan from someone once or by saying no to one thing once, it's fine if that means that you can step out of the poor man's problem. And that is something, especially, I hate to say it, but like us millennials aren't really used to. We're used to being able to do everything, get everything we want, and then at the same time, we're all depressed. Sorry, I joke about this. I don't joke about mental health, but I'm just trying to highlight some facts. It used to be, I think in my parents' day and age, when they were building a house or they'd bought a house and their friends would have bought a house, they would not go on a trip for a few years, maybe. They wouldn't take a vacation because they were paying off their house. Now we live in a society where we feel like we're supposed to be able to do everything. But if you feel like you're stuck in a financial rut, try to take some of these steps. Try to educate yourself. Try to find some resources. Listen to podcasts, read books, read articles. Go to a library. There's a lot of stuff for free out there. So you can break that poor man's problem life cycle. And I hope that by highlighting some of these things, you will just learn about it and be more aware about it, so that you can do something with it.